bedroom was dark, the kind of dark that swallows sound, that makes you hold your breath without knowing why. And in that darkness, a woman stood at the foot of a bed where two people slept, their bodies intertwined like a final insult. She raised her arm. The gun felt heavier than she remembered. 5 shots. That's all it took. 5 shots to end 2 lives, to destroy her own, and to write her name into the bloody pages of American crime history forever. But here's what they never tell you about Betty Broderick. They never tell you about the 17 years she spent building a man from nothing. They never tell you about the 4 children she raised while he studied, while he worked, while he climbed. They never tell you about the slow, methodical, soul-crushing destruction that pushed her from devoted wife to convicted killer. They never tell you how the system failed her, how the law abandoned her, how the man she loved more than life itself used every trick in his legal arsenal to erase her from existence. This is not a story about a crazy woman who snapped. This is a story about a woman who was pushed, inch by inch, year by year, until she stood at the edge of an abyss and decided that if she was going to fall, she wasn't going alone. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent years studying this case, interviewing people who knew the Brodericks, reading every court document, every letter Betty wrote from prison, every desperate plea she made to a world that had already decided she was nothing more than a scorned woman with a gun. And what I found changed everything I thought I knew about justice, about marriage, about what happens when love curdles into something dark and irreversible. Before you scroll away, before you decide this is just another true crime story about a jealous ex-wife, I need you to understand something. By the end of this story, you will question everything you believe about right and wrong. You will question whether vengeance can ever be justice. You will question whether there are circumstances, extreme, unbearable, soul-destroying circumstances, where a person can be pushed beyond the boundaries of sanity and still deserve our understanding, if not our forgiveness. If you know someone who's ever been gaslit, manipulated, or systematically destroyed by someone they loved, share this with them now. Because Betty Broderick's story is not ancient history. It's happening right now, in courtrooms and living rooms across this country, to women who have no idea that the person they trust most is capable of erasing them completely. And if you want to understand how love can become a weapon, how the legal system can be twisted into a tool of abuse, and how one woman's breaking point became a moment that still haunts America 35 years later, subscribe to this channel, because what I'm about to tell you will keep you up at night. Let's go back to the beginning, not to the murders, to the love story, because that's what this was once, a love story. San Diego, 1965. Betty Ann Bisceglia was 19 years old, a beauty queen from a strict Catholic family in Eastchester, New York. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders, a smile that could light up a room, and dreams that stretched from coast to coast. She was studying at the College of Mount St. Vincent, a good Catholic girl doing exactly what good Catholic girls were supposed to do, preparing for a life as a wife and mother, the twin pillars of feminine success in 1960s America. Daniel T. Broderick III was everything Betty had been raised to want: tall, handsome, ambitious, from a good family. He was studying at Notre Dame, that cathedral of Catholic achievement, and he had plans. big plans, law school, medical school. He would eventually complete both, a feat of endurance and ambition that few could match. When Betty looked at Dan Broderick, she saw her future. She saw security, she saw success. She saw a man who would give her everything she had ever dreamed of. They met at a football game. The details have become legend. The way their eyes locked across a crowded stadium, the instant connection that felt like fate. Betty would later say that she knew from that first moment that Dan Broderick was the man she would marry. She was 19 years old, full of hope and certainty, and she had no idea that the man smiling at her across that stadium would one day become her executioner in everything but name. They were married in 1969, just 4 years later. Betty wore white. Dan wore a suit. They stood before God and their families and promised to love each other until death did them part. Neither of them knew how literally that promise would be fulfilled. The early years were hard. There's a certain mythology that surrounds Betty Broderick, a narrative that paints her as a woman who enjoyed the fruits of her husband's labor and then turned vicious when he traded her in for a younger model. But the truth is far more complicated. The truth is that Betty Broderick didn't just support her husband's career, she built it. When Dan decided to pursue both a medical degree and a law degree simultaneously, it was Betty who held their family together. She worked as a teacher, then as a receptionist, taking any job that would keep food on the table while Dan studied. She was pregnant almost constantly during those years, her body swelling with child after child, while she stretched every dollar, clipped every coupon, and told herself that the sacrifice would be worth it. 4 children: Kim, Lee, Daniel, and Rhett. 4 beautiful children who grew up watching their mother cook and clean and work and wait for a father who was always studying, always working, always climbing toward some distant pinnacle of success. Betty did everything. She managed the household. She raised the children. She typed Dan's papers late into the night, her fingers aching on the keys while he slept. She made his appointments, picked up his dry cleaning, entertained his colleagues with dinners she prepared herself. She was the invisible engine that powered Daniel Broderick's rise. And for years she told herself that her turn would come. When he made it, when he finally reached the top of the mountain he was so determined to climb, it would be her turn to enjoy the view. And Dan did make it. He made it bigger than either of them had ever dreamed. By the early 1980s, Daniel Broderick had become one of the most successful medical malpractice attorneys in San Diego. His practice was bringing in over $1 million a year, an almost unimaginable fortune in that era. And the Brodericks moved into a sprawling house in La Jolla, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in California. They joined the country club. They threw parties. They became, by all outward appearances, the perfect American family. Betty had everything she had ever wanted: the house, the children, the husband, the status. She should have been happy. She should have been celebrating the payoff of all those years of sacrifice and struggle. But something had shifted. Something had changed in Dan. Or maybe it had always been there, lurking beneath the charm and ambition. And Betty had simply been too busy surviving to notice. Dan had become distant, cold, critical. The man who had once gazed at her with adoration now looked at her with something closer to contempt. He picked at her weight, her clothes, her conversation. Nothing she did was good enough. The house was never clean enough. The dinners were never impressive enough. She was never thin enough, never pretty enough, never enough. Betty tried harder. She dieted obsessively, trying to maintain the figure she'd had before 4 pregnancies had changed her body forever. She bought new clothes, tried new hairstyles, did everything she could think of to recapture her husband's attention. But the harder she tried, the further he pulled away. And then came Linda Kolkena. Linda was 21 years old when Dan hired her as his legal assistant in 1983. She was blonde, beautiful, and young enough to be his daughter, Betty's daughter. When Betty first heard about the new girl in Dan's office, she felt a chill run down her spine. Call it intuition. Call it the instinct of a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades studying her husband's moods and desires. Call it whatever you want. Betty knew. She knew before she found the receipts for flowers she had never received. She knew before she discovered the charges for romantic dinners at restaurants they had never visited together. She knew before the whispers started, before the pitying looks from friends, before the whole elaborate facade of her perfect life began to crumble around her. Dan was having an affair. The man she had built from nothing, the man she had sacrificed her youth and her dreams and her very identity to support, was in love with someone else. And not just anyone else. A girl, a child, practically. Someone who hadn't earned a single moment of the success Betty had spent 17 years creating. When Betty confronted Dan, he denied everything. He called her crazy, paranoid, jealous. He used his lawyer's vocabulary to make her doubt her own perceptions, to twist her legitimate concerns into evidence of her instability. He told her she needed help. He told her she was imagining things. He told her that Linda Kolkena was nothing more than a secretary, and if Betty couldn't control her irrational jealousy, perhaps she was the problem in this marriage. This is called gaslighting. In 1983, that word wasn't in common usage. There was no vocabulary for what Dan Broderick was doing to his wife, no framework for understanding the systematic psychological destruction he was engineering. Betty only knew that she felt like she was losing her mind. She knew what she saw, what she felt, what her instincts screamed at her every night when Dan came home, late smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. But her husband, the brilliant lawyer, the respected professional, the man she had trusted with her life, kept telling her she was wrong. So began the unraveling of Betty Broderick. Let me tell you something about Dan Broderick that the sanitized versions of this story often leave out. Dan Broderick was not just a successful attorney. He was a man who understood power, how to accumulate it, how to wield it, and most importantly, how to use the legal system as a weapon against anyone who threatened his carefully constructed image. In 1985, after years of denying the affair, Dan finally admitted the truth. He was in love with Linda Kolkena. He wanted a divorce, and he wanted Betty to disappear quietly, gratefully, into the margins of the life they had built together. But Betty Broderick had no intention of disappearing. After 17 years of marriage, after 4 children and countless sacrifices, after building Dan from a struggling student into a millionaire, Betty believed she was entitled to her share of the life they had created. Not just money, though she certainly deserved that. She wanted acknowledgement. She wanted Dan to admit what he had done, to take responsibility for breaking their vows, to show some basic human decency toward the woman who had given him everything. She would receive none of these things. What she would receive instead was a masterclass in legal abuse. Dan Broderick was one of the most skilled litigation attorneys in Southern California, and he was connected to every judge, every lawyer, every power player in the San Diego legal establishment. When he decided to divorce Betty, he didn't just hire a good lawyer, he weaponized the entire system against her. The divorce proceedings that followed were not a negotiation between two former partners. They were an annihilation campaign, with Dan Broderick using every tool at his disposal to destroy his wife financially, emotionally, and psychologically. First, he moved out of the family home, taking the children with him. Betty came home one day to find her house empty, her children gone, her life upended without warning or explanation. Dan had obtained an ex parte order, a legal motion made without the other party present, giving him temporary custody of all 4 children. Betty wasn't even notified until after the fact. This would become a pattern. Dan's connections in the legal community meant that he had access to judges and procedures that ordinary citizens could only dream of. He filed motion after motion, each one designed to drain Betty's resources and sanity. When she responded emotionally, and who wouldn't respond emotionally to having their children taken without warning, her reactions were documented and used as evidence of her instability. The financial abuse was equally systematic. Dan controlled all the money. He had always controlled all the money, even during their marriage. Now, in the divorce, he used that control to slowly strangle Betty's ability to fight back. He reduced her support payments arbitrarily, claiming financial difficulties that were transparently false. When she fell behind on bills, he used her financial problems as evidence that she was incapable of managing money. When she complained about the inadequate support, he painted her as greedy and materialistic. Betty hired lawyer after lawyer, but none of them could match Dan's connections or his willingness to pursue scorched earth tactics. Each attorney eventually withdrew from the case, unable or unwilling to go up against one of the most powerful lawyers in the region. Betty was left to represent herself against a man who could tie the court system in knots with his eyes closed. And through it all, Dan continued his relationship with Linda Kolkena. He flaunted it. He brought Linda to events where Betty might see them. He introduced Linda to the children, to their friends, to everyone in the social circle that Betty had spent years cultivating. It was as if he was erasing Betty in real time, replacing her with a younger, more compliant model, while she watched helplessly from the margins. The children were caught in the middle of this war, and the damage done to them cannot be overstated. Dan systematically turned them against their mother, using a combination of bribery and manipulation that family therapists would later recognize as a textbook case of parental alienation. He bought them cars, gave them unlimited spending money, told them stories about their mother's instability that may or may not have been true. The children, caught between 2 warring parents, chose the parent who wasn't visibly falling apart, because Betty was falling apart. How could she not be? Imagine for a moment that everything you built over 17 years, your marriage, your family, your social standing, your very identity, was being systematically dismantled by someone who knew exactly how to work the system. Imagine that the person doing this to you was someone you had once loved more than life itself, someone you had sacrificed everything for. Imagine that every time you tried to fight back, you were painted as the villain, the crazy ex-wife, the bitter woman who couldn't accept that her marriage was over. Betty's behavior during these years was erratic. That much is undeniable. She left obscene messages on Dan's answering machine, dozens of them, screaming and cursing and raging against the injustice of what was being done to her. She drove her car through the front door of Dan's new house, the one he shared with Linda. She showed up at their home uninvited, confronting them with the fury of a woman who had been pushed past all reasonable limits. Dan documented everything, every phone call, every incident, every outburst. He was building a case, compiling evidence that would prove Betty was dangerous, unstable, mentally ill. And when he went to court with this evidence, the judges, his colleagues, his friends, the people he had worked with for years, believed him. Betty was held in contempt of court multiple times. She was jailed briefly for her violations of various court orders. Each punishment only deepened her sense of persecution, her belief that the entire system was conspiring against her. And here's the thing that makes this story so complicated, so resistant to easy judgment. She wasn't entirely wrong. The San Diego legal community did circle the wagons around Dan Broderick. Judges who should have recused themselves due to personal relationships with Dan instead presided over hearings that affected Betty's life and liberty. Procedures that should have protected both parties were twisted to favor the more powerful litigant. The system that was supposed to provide justice instead provided Dan with an arsenal of weapons to use against his ex-wife. I want to pause here and ask you something. What would you do if you found yourself in Betty's position, watching everything you built being stolen by someone who had the power to rewrite reality, who could make the legal system dance to his tune, who was slowly erasing you from your own life while the world called you crazy for objecting? What would you do? I'm not asking you to condone what Betty eventually did. I'm asking you to sit with the impossible position she found herself in. I'm asking you to consider whether there are circumstances so extreme, so systematically unjust, that they can break even the strongest person. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. Have you ever felt completely powerless against someone who held all the cards? Have you ever watched someone use their power to destroy another person while the world looked the other way? The divorce was finalized in 1989, 4 years after it began. 4 years of constant warfare, of motions and counter-motions, of psychological torture dressed up in legal language. When the final settlement came down, Betty received far less than she had expected, far less than she believed she deserved after 17 years of building Dan's career. Dan, meanwhile, was thriving. His practice was more successful than ever. He was engaged to Linda Kolkena, planning a wedding that would take place in the very church where he had married Betty 2 decades earlier. He had won. Completely, utterly, totally won. He had gotten everything he wanted: the money, the children, the young bride, the social standing. And Betty was left with nothing but her rage and her memories, and the slowly crystallizing knowledge that there was no justice for her in this world. The legal system had failed her. The social system had failed her. Her own children had turned against her. She was 50 years old, alone, financially devastated, and watching the man who had destroyed her life prepare to marry the woman he had replaced her with. Something inside Betty Broderick shifted during those final months of 1989. And the part of her that had still believed in justice, in fairness, in the possibility that things might somehow work out, that part finally died. And in its place grew something else, something dark, something that had been fed by years of humiliation and betrayal until it was strong enough to take action. Betty Broderick began to plan. The house in La Jolla haunted Betty long after she stopped living there. She would drive past it sometimes late at night and see the lights glowing in windows that had once framed her life. She would imagine Linda Kolkena walking through rooms Betty had decorated, sleeping in the bed where Betty's children had been conceived, taking over the life that Betty had spent 17 years building. It was during these midnight drives that Betty began talking to herself. Long conversations with no one, rehearsing arguments she would never get to make, defending herself to a jury that existed only in her imagination. She would explain over and over how she wasn't crazy, how everything that had happened to her was real, how she had been a good wife, a good mother, a good person who had done everything right and still lost everything. The friends who might have helped her had mostly drifted away. Taking sides in a divorce is uncomfortable, and most people prefer to avoid discomfort. Besides, Dan's version of events was compelling. He was a respected attorney, a pillar of the community. When he said his ex-wife was unstable, people believed him. When Betty tried to tell her side of the story, she came across as bitter and obsessive, which, by that point, she probably was. Years of trauma will do that to a person. Her children's rejection was the wound that never healed. Kim, the eldest, had sided firmly with her father, cutting off contact with Betty almost entirely. Lee, the second daughter, maintained a fragile relationship with her mother but clearly struggled with divided loyalties. The boys, Dan Jr. and Rhett, were caught in the middle, loving their mother but also enjoying the material comforts their father provided. Betty felt herself becoming a ghost in her own children's lives, someone they were vaguely ashamed of, someone they made excuses for at school when other kids asked why their parents were in the news again. I want you to understand what isolation does to a person. Humans are social creatures. We need connection, need to be seen and understood, need to know that somewhere in this vast world, someone believes our version of events. When that connection is severed, when everyone around you accepts a narrative that erases your truth, something fundamental breaks inside you. Betty Broderick was profoundly, catastrophically isolated by the fall of 1989. She lived alone in a house that was too big for one person, surrounded by photographs of children who rarely visited and memories of a marriage that had ended in ruins. She took long baths, trying to quiet the thoughts that raced through her mind at all hours. She wrote letters to Dan, to the children, to anyone who might listen, pouring out her grievances in sprawling, repetitive missives that only reinforced everyone's belief that she had lost her grip on reality. The truth was more complicated than madness. Betty Broderick was not insane. She was traumatized. She was isolated. She was the victim of a coordinated campaign of legal and psychological abuse that had stripped her of everything that gave her life meaning. And she was absolutely, completely beyond all reason, enraged. Rage is a peculiar emotion. In small doses, it can be clarifying, even motivating. But when it becomes the dominant feature of your inner landscape, when it's all you feel from the moment you wake to the moment you finally fall into restless sleep, it begins to reshape you. Your thoughts become organized around the object of your rage. Your memories are filtered through it. Your sense of possibility narrows until revenge seems like the only meaningful action left. Betty had tried everything else. She had tried the courts and lost. She had tried reasoning with Dan and been dismissed. She had tried appealing to mutual friends and been abandoned. She had tried therapy and medication and every other intervention that well-meaning people suggested. Nothing worked. Nothing could work, because the problem wasn't inside Betty's head. The problem was outside, in a world that had decided she didn't matter. The wedding announcement arrived in October 1989. Dan and Linda would be married in April 1990. It would be a lavish affair, befitting a man of Dan's stature. A man whose stature had been built on Betty's back, with Betty's labor, through Betty's sacrifice. And Betty wasn't invited. Of course she wasn't invited. She was the crazy ex-wife, the embarrassing chapter in Dan Broderick's success story that everyone preferred to forget. But Betty would not be forgotten. She began acquiring weapons in the weeks following the announcement. First, a revolver, which she told herself was for protection. A woman living alone needed protection, didn't she? Then ammunition. Then she began practicing at a shooting range, learning to handle the gun with something approaching competence. Did she know what she was planning? That question has been debated for 35 years. Betty herself has given conflicting accounts, sometimes claiming the shooting was unplanned, other times suggesting she had thought about it for months. What seems clear is that something in her had shifted from endurance to action. She was done waiting for justice that would never come. She was done accepting a verdict that erased her contribution to the life Dan now enjoyed with another woman. She was going to write her own ending. The night of November 4th, 1989, was cool and quiet. Betty drove to the house on Coral Reef, the house Dan shared with Linda, the house that had been purchased with money Betty believed was rightfully hers. She used a key she had retained from when the children were still staying with her, a key Dan had apparently forgotten to confiscate. The house was dark. Betty moved through it like a ghost, past furniture she didn't recognize, past photographs in which she didn't appear, past all evidence of the life that had gone on without her. She climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would wake the sleeping couple. But they didn't wake. Not until Betty was standing at the foot of their bed, looking down at Dan and Linda, tangled together in sheets Betty had never seen. In a room Betty had never entered in a life that should have been hers. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. The first shot went into Linda Kolkena. She died almost instantly, the bullet striking her in the head as she lay sleeping. She was 28 years old. She had been Dan's secretary, then his lover, then his fiancée. In 6 months, she would have been his wife. Now she was nothing. A body in a bed, blood spreading across the pillow. Dan woke to the sound. He saw Betty standing there, saw the gun in her hand, saw his young lover dying beside him. In that moment, everything that had passed between them, the love, the hatred, the years of legal warfare, collapsed into a single terrifying instant. He reached for the phone. Perhaps he was trying to call 911. Perhaps he was trying to reach for some way to stop what was happening. He never made it. Betty fired again and again and again. The bullet struck Dan in the back and chest as he tried to escape, tried to survive, tried to live past this moment of reckoning. He failed. When the gun was empty, Betty stood in the sudden silence, surrounded by the smell of gunpowder and the reality of what she had done. 2 people were dead. Her ex-husband, his young fiancée, the people who had, in her mind, stolen her life and faced no consequences for the theft. Now they had faced consequences. The ultimate consequences. Betty picked up the phone that Dan had been reaching for. She disconnected it from the wall, then walked out of the house, got in her car, and drove away. It was over. 17 years of marriage, 4 years of divorce, months of rage and planning, all of it culminating in less than a minute of violence. She went to a friend's house and confessed. By morning, she was in police custody, and the story that would captivate America was beginning to unfold. The media coverage was immediate and intense. This wasn't just a double homicide. It was a scandal involving one of San Diego's most prominent families, a tale of jealousy and revenge that seemed ripped from a soap opera. The press couldn't get enough. Betty Broderick's face was everywhere, her story dissected by talking heads who had never met her, her motives analyzed by experts who knew nothing of what she had endured. The narrative that emerged was predictable. Scorned woman kills ex-husband and his young bride. Hell hath no fury and all that. Betty was painted as a monster, a cautionary tale about the dangers of female rage, a warning to other divorced women about what happens when you can't let go. But there was another narrative running beneath the official story like an underground river. This narrative was told in whispers, in private conversations among women who had been through difficult divorces themselves. This narrative said that Betty Broderick had been driven to madness by a man who had systematically destroyed her. This narrative said that while murder was never justified, the circumstances that led to it were all too familiar. This narrative asked uncomfortable questions about power, about the legal system, about what happens when one spouse has all the resources and the other has nothing but her rage. Betty's first trial ended in a hung jury. The jurors couldn't agree on whether she was guilty of first-degree murder, cold-blooded, premeditated killing, or something lesser. Some of them had clearly been moved by her claims of abuse, had seen in her story echoes of situations they recognized. The prosecutors were furious. The public was fascinated. And Betty Broderick, despite having confessed to the killings, remained unconvicted. The second trial was different. The prosecution had learned from their mistakes. They were more careful about jury selection, more systematic in presenting their case. They painted Betty not as a victim, but as a calculating killer who had planned her revenge for months and executed it with cold efficiency. This time, the jury convicted. Betty Broderick was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 32 years to life in prison, 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, plus 2 additional years for illegal gun use. She was 52 years old. Unless she received parole, she would die in prison. But here's what the headlines never told you. Here's what got lost in the sensationalism and the moral panic and the endless debates about whether Betty Broderick was a monster or a victim. Betty Broderick was, above all, a mother. She had raised 4 children. She had changed their diapers, nursed their fevers, helped with their homework, attended their school plays. She had driven them to soccer practice and dance lessons and birthday parties. She had been present for every milestone of their young lives. While Dan was working or studying or climbing the ladder, that would eventually allow him to leave her behind. And now those children had no parents at all. Their father was dead. Their mother was in prison. They were adults by this point, technically. But adulthood doesn't insulate you from the kind of trauma that the Broderick children endured. Kim, the eldest, testified against her mother at the trial. She described years of Betty's erratic behavior, the obscene messages, the property destruction, the chaos. She said she had been afraid of her mother. She said she believed Betty was capable of violence long before November 5th, 1989. Her testimony was devastating. The words of a daughter who had chosen her father and now blamed her mother for taking him away. Lee, the second daughter, had a more complicated relationship with the truth. She loved her mother. She had always loved her mother, even during the worst years of the divorce. But she had also seen things she couldn't explain away, heard things that frightened her, watched her mother's sanity erode year after year. Lee would later write a book about her experiences, trying to make sense of a tragedy that had consumed her entire family. The boys processed their trauma in different ways. Dan Jr. struggled with his father's legacy, with the question of whether the man he had loved had truly been the villain his mother claimed. Rhett, the youngest, tried to maintain relationships with everyone, refusing to take sides even when sides seemed impossible to avoid. What strikes me most about the Broderick children is how completely they were failed by the adults in their lives. Betty and Dan were so consumed by their war against each other that they couldn't see what they were doing to the people they both claimed to love most. The children became weapons, ammunition, collateral damage in a conflict they never asked to be part of. This is one of the darkest truths about high conflict divorce. The children always suffer most. They're forced to take sides, to testify against their own parents, to carry the weight of adult grievances that have nothing to do with them. The Broderick children carry that weight to this day. Betty, from her prison cell, has had decades to contemplate her actions and their consequences. She has given interviews over the years, sometimes expressing remorse, other times defending herself with the same arguments she made at her trial. She has applied for parole multiple times, and each time she has been denied. The parole board's reasoning is instructive. They say that Betty has never fully accepted responsibility for her actions. They say she still minimizes what she did, still portrays herself primarily as a victim rather than a perpetrator. They say that until she can acknowledge the full horror of taking 2 human lives, she cannot be safely released into society. Betty's supporters argue that this is a catch-22. How can she acknowledge the full horror of what she did while also maintaining that she was driven to it by circumstances beyond her control? How can she accept responsibility without also demanding that the world acknowledge the responsibility of those who pushed her to the breaking point? There are no easy answers to these questions. That's what makes Betty Broderick's story so enduring, so resistant to simple moral judgment. She did something terrible. She also had terrible things done to her. Both truths exist simultaneously, and trying to reconcile them has occupied observers for more than 3 decades. Let me tell you about a different Betty Broderick. Not the woman with the gun, not the prisoner in the orange jumpsuit, but the woman who existed before all of this. Before Dan, before the divorce, before everything fell apart. Elizabeth Ann Bicheglia was born on November 7, 1947, in Bronxville, New York. the fifth of 6 children in a strict Catholic family. Her father was a successful businessman, her mother a homemaker who ran their household with military precision. Betty grew up in an environment where appearances mattered enormously, where success was measured in social standing and proper behavior, where women were expected to support their husbands and raise their children and never ever make a scene. She was a good student, a popular girl, a young woman who seemed destined for the kind of comfortable, conventional life that her parents had modeled. She believed in marriage. She believed in family. She believed that if you did everything right, supported your husband, raised your children, maintained your home, you would be rewarded with security and love and a partner who would never abandon you. These beliefs were not irrational. They were the dominant cultural narrative of her time, reinforced by religion and family and every message that society sent to young women about their role in the world. Betty didn't invent these ideas. She absorbed them. When she married Dan Broderick, she committed herself to living them out with absolute fidelity. The tragedy of Betty Broderick is that she did everything her culture told her to do, and it didn't protect her. She supported her husband. She raised his children. She sacrificed her own ambitions for his. She played by all the rules, and in the end, she was discarded like last year's fashion, replaced by a younger woman who hadn't earned any of what she was inheriting. This is what her defenders understand. This is why Betty's story resonates so powerfully with women who have lived through similar experiences, minus the violence. They see in her story the ultimate betrayal of the social contract that women of Betty's generation were taught to believe in. They see a system that asked everything of women and then offered them nothing when their usefulness was exhausted. The legal system that was supposed to protect Betty during her divorce instead became a weapon against her. This is not speculation, it is documented fact. Dan Broderick's connections in the San Diego legal community gave him advantages that no ordinary litigant would have had. Judges who should have recused themselves presided over his case. Procedures that should have been neutral were bent in his favor. The system that promised equal justice under law delivered something very different. Does this justify murder? No. Nothing justifies murder. But it explains something about how Betty reached the point of picking up that gun. It helps us understand how a woman who had lived a law-abiding, conventional life for 50 years could become capable of such violence. She believed that the law had abandoned her, that there was no legitimate avenue for the justice she craved, that the only power left to her was the power of life and death. This is what happens when systems fail. When people lose faith in the institutions that are supposed to protect them, they become capable of things that would otherwise be unthinkable. Betty Broderick is an extreme case, but the pattern she represents is not unique. Throughout history, people who have been systematically oppressed, systematically denied justice, systematically pushed to the margins, and have sometimes responded with violence that shocks and horrifies mainstream society. This is not an excuse. It is a diagnosis. If we want to prevent future Betty Brodericks, we need to examine the systems that created her. We need to look at how divorce courts handle high conflict cases, how power imbalances between spouses affect legal outcomes, how the wealthy and well-connected can manipulate the law to destroy their opponents. We need to understand that people who feel they have no legitimate options sometimes choose illegitimate ones. In the years since the murders, Betty Broderick's story has taken on a life of its own. It has been adapted into television movies, examined in documentaries, analyzed in books and articles and academic papers. Each retelling shapes the narrative in different ways, emphasizing different aspects, drawing different conclusions. The 1992 television movie starring Meredith Baxter was sympathetic to Betty. It presented her as a woman driven to madness by a cruel and manipulative husband, a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Viewers who watched that movie came away with the impression that while Betty's actions were wrong, they were understandable, perhaps even inevitable, given what she had endured. Other retellings have been less kind. Some have emphasized Betty's own behavior and the obscene messages, the property destruction, the years of harassment, and painted her as an unstable woman who had been enabled by a society too willing to make excuses for female rage. These accounts remind us that Dan Broderick, whatever his flaws, did not deserve to die. That Linda Kolkena, who was guilty of nothing more than falling in love with the wrong man, was an innocent victim who has too often been forgotten in the focus on Betty's grievances. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. But what interests me most about the various retellings of Betty Broderick's story is what they reveal about our cultural moment. In the early 1990s, when the sympathetic movie was made, there was a growing awareness of issues like domestic abuse, gaslighting, and the ways that the legal system fails women. Betty's story fit neatly into that emerging consciousness. Today, in an era of renewed attention to violence and its consequences, some are more skeptical of narratives that seem to excuse or justify killing. They worry that portraying Betty as a victim minimizes the horror of what she did, sends a dangerous message to others who might be contemplating similar actions. They remind us that there are no circumstances that justify taking a human life, that Betty had other options she chose not to exercise. Both perspectives have validity. Both can be held simultaneously. That's the uncomfortable territory that Betty Broderick's story forces us into, a place where sympathy and condemnation coexist, where understanding the causes of violence doesn't require excusing its outcomes. Betty herself has contributed to this ongoing debate from her prison cell. She has given interviews over the years, sometimes tearful and remorseful, other times defiant and self-justifying. She has written letters, spoken to journalists, tried to shape the narrative of her own life from behind bars. She has never stopped insisting that she was wronged, never stopped maintaining that what happened to her was unjust, never stopped believing that the world should understand why she did what she did. The parole board has heard all of this. 4 times Betty has applied for parole. 4 times she has been denied. The board says she lacks insight into her actions, that she continues to blame others for choices that were ultimately hers. They say she poses a danger to society, not because she might kill again, but because she has never demonstrated the kind of transformation that would indicate genuine rehabilitation. Betty's supporters say the board is punishing her for refusing to play a role, for maintaining her truth, even when that truth is inconvenient. They say that demanding she express more remorse is asking her to lie, to pretend to believe things she doesn't believe, to perform a version of repentance that might satisfy the board but wouldn't reflect her genuine experience. This is one of the most vexing questions in our criminal justice system. What does genuine remorse look like? How can we distinguish between someone who is truly changed and someone who's simply saying what we want to hear? Is it fair to keep someone incarcerated because they won't adopt a particular narrative about their own actions? I don't have answers to these questions. I'm not sure anyone does. What I do know is that Betty Broderick, now in her late 70s, remains in prison. She has spent more than 3 decades behind bars, more time than many murderers serve. Whether this is justice or vindictiveness depends entirely on how you weigh the various factors of her case. Let me tell you about what happened to the Broderick children, because their story is often lost in the shadow of their parents' tragedy. Kim, the eldest daughter, became the most vocal defender of her father's memory. She testified against her mother at the trial, describing years of instability and fear. After the conviction, she largely severed ties with Betty, unable to forgive the woman who had killed her father and disrupted her entire life. Kim went on to build her own life, her own family, but the wounds of her childhood never fully healed. Lee took a different path. Of all the children, she maintained the closest relationship with Betty over the years. She visited her mother in prison, wrote letters, tried to understand and forgive. Lee also struggled, though, with relationships with trust. With the legacy of having both of her parents taken from her in different ways, she has spoken publicly about her experiences, trying to make sense of the senseless, trying to find meaning in tragedy. The boys, Dan Jr. and Rhett, have largely stayed out of the public eye. They've built their own lives, their own families, trying to move past the events of their childhood. But sources close to the family suggest that the trauma never disappears, that it simply goes underground, emerging in unexpected ways, in difficulties with intimacy, in challenges with their own parenting, in the 1,000 small ways that childhood wounds shape adult lives. What strikes me most about the Broderick children is the impossibility of their position. They loved both of their parents. They were forced to choose between them. And now they live with the knowledge that their mother killed their father, that their father's actions contributed to their mother becoming a killer, that there are no good guys in this story, only broken people and the destruction they left in their wake. The children's suffering is perhaps the strongest argument against the kind of vengeance Betty pursued, whatever satisfaction she might have felt in those moments after the shooting, whatever sense of justice or completion or release, it came at the cost of her children's well-being. They lost both parents that night. They lost their father to death and their mother to prison. They were left to navigate adulthood without the guidance of either, haunted by a tragedy that defined their family in the eyes of the world. Betty has expressed remorse for what she did to her children. This, more than anything else, seems to cause her genuine pain. Not the deaths themselves necessarily, but the impact on Kim and Lee and Dan Jr. and Rhett. She has said in interviews that if she could go back, knowing what she knows now about how it would affect them, she might make different choices. But that's the terrible thing about irreversible actions. You can't go back. You can't undo the damage. You can only live with the consequences, watching them ripple outward through generations, touching people who weren't even born when the events occurred. Betty Broderick's grandchildren are growing up in the shadow of what she did. Her great-grandchildren may grow up with the same burden. The legacy of that night extends far beyond the two people who died. As I sit here, preparing to conclude this story, I find myself thinking about endings, about how we expect stories to resolve, about the satisfaction we crave from narrative closure, about the discomfort we feel when real life refuses to provide tidy conclusions. Betty Broderick's story doesn't have a satisfying ending. Not yet, anyway. She remains in prison, elderly now, her health declining, her chances of ever walking free diminishing with each passing year. She has outlived her own notoriety. The young people who encounter her story today often have no memory of the original events, no context for the passions it once aroused. But in another sense, Betty got what she wanted. She was not forgotten. She was not erased the way Dan seemed determined to erase her. Her story has been told and retold, each version keeping her alive in the public imagination. She became famous, infamous, and that fame has outlasted both her ex-husband and the woman he left her for. Is that a victory? It's hard to say. Betty would probably argue that it is, that being remembered as a killer is better than not being remembered at all. Her critics would say that this is precisely the kind of disordered thinking that makes her dangerous. The inability to distinguish between attention and validation, between notoriety and respect. What I know is that Betty Broderick's story continues to resonate because it touches on themes that never go away. The betrayal of trust, the failure of institutions, the question of what we owe to people who have given us everything, the terrible calculus of revenge, whether it ever truly satisfies, whether it ever truly heals, whether it's ever worth the cost. And the legal reforms that Betty's case inspired are often forgotten. After her trial, there was renewed attention to the issue of economic abuse in divorce, to the ways that wealthy spouses can use the legal system to impoverish and control their partners. Some jurisdictions reformed their procedures to prevent the kind of conflicts of interest that marked the Broderick divorce. Some judges became more aware of the dynamics of high-conflict dissolution, more careful about the appearance of fairness, even when the reality was complicated. Did these changes come too late for Betty? Obviously. But they may have helped other women, other families navigate difficult divorces without descending into the kind of catastrophe that consumed the Brodericks. That's something, I suppose. That's a legacy beyond the violence. I want to end with something that may surprise you, something that challenges the narrative we've been told about Betty Broderick, about revenge, about what it means to claim victory from the jaws of defeat. Betty Broderick is not broken. After more than 30 years in prison, after losing her children's custody, after becoming one of the most notorious criminals in California history, Betty Broderick has not been destroyed. She has aged, certainly. She has suffered, undoubtedly. But she has also survived. She has maintained her sense of self, her belief in her own narrative, her conviction that what happened to her was wrong, even if what she did was also wrong. This is not what the system expected. The system expected her to break, to crumble, to transform into the broken, remorseful penitent that the parole board keeps demanding. The system expected her rage to burn itself out, leaving nothing but ashes and regret. The system expected to win, but Betty didn't let them win. In her own way, on her own terms, she achieved something that looks very much like victory. She made sure that Dan Broderick could never forget her, could never fully escape her. could never enjoy his new life without the shadow of her presence. She made sure that Linda Kolkena never got to be Mrs. Daniel Broderick III, never got to enjoy the wedding or the social status or any of the things that Betty had been promised and denied. And most importantly, Betty made sure that her story was told. Not the sanitized version that Dan would have preferred, not the crazy ex-wife narrative that the legal system tried to impose, but her story, the story of a woman who gave everything and was left with nothing, who was pushed and pushed until she pushed back with fatal consequences. Is this justice? It's not the justice that courts dispense, measured in years and statutes and procedural regularity. It's a more ancient kind of justice, the kind that humans understood before we invented legal systems. The justice of blood for blood, suffering for suffering, an eye for an eye. Betty Broderick completed her revenge. She executed it with precision and finality, and while she has paid an enormous price for that execution, she has never indicated that she believes the price was too high. In her calculus, the scales are balanced now. Dan took everything from her, and she took everything from him. They are even. I'm not asking you to agree with this calculus. I'm not asking you to admire Betty Broderick or hold her up as a role model. What I'm asking you to do is understand the terrible logic of revenge, the way it can seem like the only rational choice when all other options have been foreclosed. What I'm asking you to understand is how a person can become capable of the unthinkable, step by step, choice by choice, until they're standing at the foot of a bed with a gun in their hand. Betty Broderick's story ends where it began, with a woman who refused to be erased. She was not a good woman, not by the end, but she was not a passive woman. She did not accept the verdict that the world tried to impose on her. She wrote her own ending, and no matter how many years she spends in prison, no one can take that from her. The last time Betty Broderick was denied parole, she showed no visible reaction. She has been through this before. She knows what they want from her, and she knows she cannot give it, cannot pretend to feel regret she doesn't feel, cannot adopt a narrative that erases her truth. She will die in prison most likely, and she has made her peace with that. Because in the end, Betty Broderick got what she wanted. Not happiness, not freedom, not the life she dreamed of when she was 19 years old, looking across a football stadium at a handsome young man who would eventually destroy her. But something else, something that might be more important to her than any of those things. She got revenge. Complete, total, irreversible revenge. And that, in Betty Broderick's accounting, is enough. Thank you for staying with me through the story. I know it was difficult. I know it raised questions that don't have easy answers. But that's why stories like this matter. Because they force us to confront the complexity of human experience, the darkness that exists in all of us, the thin line between civilization and chaos. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you question assumptions you didn't even know you held, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel, because I'm going to keep telling stories like this one. Stories that challenge and disturb and ultimately illuminate. And leave a comment below. After everything you've heard, what do you think Betty Broderick's story means? What does it teach us about love, about revenge, about the limits of human endurance? I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe. And remember, the person you love most might also be the person who can hurt you most. That's the terrible truth at the heart of Betty Broderick's story. That's the warning and the lesson and the tragedy, all wrapped up in one. This is her story. But in some ways, it's all of our stories.